But let's go over some of the, there's some things that people say when they're in their defense of Israel. One of them being, well, the Palestinians. So first of all, they lost the war, and so when you lose a war, you lose land, and that's that. What do you say to that?
Well, again, that's completely illegal, and that's not the law. And they didn't start the war. They were simply caught in the middle whatsoever. Israel started the war. Jordan jumped into the war. But of course, again, as I said, the Israelis had screwed the Palestinians and done a secret deal with the king of Jordan that he would take control of the West Bank back in 48 in the first place. So and look, the UN Security Council, they go, oh, hey, the General Assembly recommendation said we could steal all this land. Yeah, but nothing the United Nations has ever said since then counts at all, including UN Security Council resolutions that say, get the hell out of the occupied territories right now. You know what they do? They go, oh, yeah, well, the French version doesn't have the word "the" in it. And so it just says, get out of the occupied territories, but you didn't say which ones. And so all we did was withdraw from the Sinai. And, give me a break. They're the most cynical. And that's the thing. How do you deal with, they say, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. How do you deal with the Israelis when nothing that they sign means anything anyway? They'll break any deal. They'll lie right to the Americans' face. They'll agree to anything, sign anything, and laugh about it. I mean, there's the famous candid camera footage of Benjamin Netanyahu in the year 2000 laughing about how he sexually assaulted Bill Clinton right in the face and got away with it, did whatever he wanted. I told Bill this, and then I did that. I told him, geez, Bill, all I need is these military security zones. But then, that's all of Area C. That's 2/3 of the West Bank. And then the lady says, geez, Bibi, are you sure you want to do the Americans that way? What if they get angry? And he says, the Americans are easily moved. It's absurd. I'll do whatever I want. And, that's exactly the way they play it. So they always blame the Palestinians. But the Israelis, they'll break any deal, and they'll break any even stipulation in the middle of a deal. Right? Yeah. They'll be in the middle of negotiations and say, well, we'll close down these checkpoints, but then they don't, or whatever it is. You know what I mean? It's like the Branch Davidians dealing with the hostage rescue team outside. Nothing the negotiators say really sticks when it comes to the tactical guys.
Have the Palestinians ever been truly offered a two-state solution and then just rejected it?
No, absolutely not. And this is the one place where on a detail on this is where Viva Free got me, was he claimed falsely that at 2000 that Arafat demanded the absolute full and total right of return to all Palestinian refugees to Israel proper. And that's not true at all. In fact, all that they had said, and the Israelis had agreed to this, was that they would recognize the right of return, but then they would actually allow a nominal amount, 20 to 60,000 people would be allowed to return. Less than 100,000 people would be allowed to come back to their homes. The rest would be allowed to come to the West Bank or to the Gaza Strip, the new independent state, supposedly. But the deal was never even offered. And there's a book about this called The Truth About Camp David by Clayton Swisher, where he explains, for one thing, it was Clinton's fault. Clinton gave them way too little time to deal, and then his people were not prepared. They threw out Resolution 242 as the basis of the negotiations, which meant that they had to start from scratch, but they weren't sure which scratch they were starting from. And the original position paper left out some Palestinian and some Israeli objections, which sent everybody, flipping out and scurrying and wasting days. And then in the end, they never even offered him a deal. And Arafat knew that they were essentially setting him up. And so he cut his losses earlier instead of later. But I would encourage people to go and look at this, because you know what? I'm sure probably everybody listening to this has heard that at Camp David in 2000, they offered Arafat not just a two-state solution, but the moon. And he told them to go to hell, because you know how those filthy Arabs are. Everybody's heard that a million times over. But Norman Finkelstein in 2005, he debated Shlomo Ben Ami, who was one of the Israeli negotiators at Camp David, and they debated on Democracy Now! And I'd urge you to be careful, because there are two different debates that they did. This is the one about Camp David in 2000. And Shlomo Ben Ami says, I wouldn't have signed it either. And in fact, there was no real deal on offer. There was no deal on paper. But he just says the way that we were going, it was not fair. The deal that they were getting was one that was essentially made to fail. and
Yeah.
that Arafat had no choice but to reject it. And in fact, in Swisher's book, he has a scene where, and he interviewed all the principals, and he has a scene where Arafat says to Bill Clinton, now, come on, man, you know the Israelis are being intransigent on this and this and that, don't you? And Clinton says, yes. And he goes, so listen, when this all falls apart, you're not going to blame me. And Clinton goes, no, I promise I won't. And then, yeah, right. And then that's what they did. They blamed it all on him. And this myth was made. But here's what's so funny about this. Again, with all these slogans, if anyone just stops and thinks critically about first of all, isn't it funny how all of their arguments are just these kind of little like claims without any real like fleshing out of detail. It's always just, you're supposed to accept the truth of what they say,
Right.
that Arafat rejected the deal, for example. But just think about it for a minute. If that was really true, well, then how come Ariel Sharon didn't just offer him a deal the next day after Ehud Barak was gone? Or how come Barak couldn't get it worked out by the end of the year? Or how come Ariel Sharon didn't do it? Or how come after Ariel Sharon went into his coma and Ehud Olmert came in, he's a much more reasonable man than Sharon or Netanyahu, and nothing like the bloody record of either of them, at least at the time. How come Ehud Olmert didn't give him a state? The most Ehud Olmert ever did was he offered Mahmoud Abbas a deal, but he said, I don't have a map. I can't show you a map. And said they drew it on a piece of paper and said, well, how about this? And he said, look, man, I can't make a deal based on a map. And then Ehud Olmert himself later said, hey, if I was him, I wouldn't have been able to accept that deal either. How could I possibly expect him to accept that? There's no way we could accept that. So they do this over and over again. And then, so now it's been 23 years since Camp David. How come you don't give them a two-state solution right now?
Yeah.
How come you haven't given them a two-state solution? Gee, we were willing, Kim, to give them the entire West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the moon that one day, but you got 15 seconds to decide. And if you don't accept, then you never, ever, ever get to have that option again or that opportunity again. Give me a break, dude.
Right.
Obviously, they're lying. You know why? The Israelis want to steal that West Bank. They call it Judea and Samaria. They claim it belongs to them. The Palestinians there, they're just going to have to lay down and die. The Bible says we get to steal what belongs to you. And so your natural property right is superseded by our make-believe supernatural property right. And that's it. And they'll tell any lie and they'll pretend anything. Look, the entire process of, certainly since the killing of Rabin in 95, the entire so-called peace process toward a two-state solution was always an illusion. The whole thing was just putting off the idea, like you talked about, of equal citizenship for everyone in what is already one state. The Israelis annexed already, whether they call it that or not, they annexed all of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip back in 1967. But if you call it that, then you got to admit it's an apartheid state. But if you say, no, we're going to give you independence one day, then you can put that off. Well, they did. And like I was saying, that all came to an end during Trump. Netanyahu said, look, there's not going to be an independent state. We're never going to. And he had said before, oh, yeah, sure, one day, I promise. Oh, yeah. He stopped saying that in 2000. In 2020. And this is why B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International all came out with their reports in 2021, officially declaring it an apartheid state. I mean, you got to understand the politics of this. And the State Department, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch both are essentially arms of the U.S. State Department. These are extremely center-left Hillary Clinton liberals, right? Maybe one click to the left of her, but they are not radicals in any way. And they have never been in any hurry to condemn Israel as an apartheid state. What happened in 2021 was after Netanyahu almost officially annexed the Jordan River Valley and much of the rest of the West Bank, all of Area C and all that is what they talked about, and gave those talks where he explained there will always be one state, one security force from the river to the sea permanently. At that point, they said, okay, the lie is expired. The illusion is over. We were pretending to believe that we were on the way to a two-state solution. But now that the prime minister is instructing us that we may not pretend anymore, well, now we got to call a spade a spade. it is apartheid. It's even less than half the population, barely, ruling the rest.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, they say things now like, "Well, see what happened in Gaza. This is why we can't have, you know, we gave them a state. We've shown the world what a Palestinian state looks like and what it ends up doing. But how can you possibly be your own sovereign nation without control over your resources, your borders, your ports, your imports, your exports?
Right.
Like, I mean, it's a joke if you can't actually control what comes in and out." And you can't, you know, that's not actually a sovereign nation. One of the excuses that they often say, I often hear is, well, we don't have to give them a land. We don't have to give them a state when they're hostile to us. They want to destroy us. And so therefore they don't deserve a state. But I'm sitting here thinking, what right do any of us have to friendly neighbors? I mean, as countries, I mean, there's plenty of countries that have hostile neighbors right on their borders that want to destroy them or want to battle them all the time. Nobody gets the right to friendly neighbors. I mean, you have to give them a state because that's what you have to do. That's the right thing to do. And then try to make peace with your neighbor at that point, after that. But certainly never going to make peace with them by subjugating them and oppressing them and denying them human rights, basic human rights. I mean, they don't have a friendly relationship with Syria. So what are they complaining about? Syria is still a nation. Does that suddenly mean Syria doesn't have a right to exist as a nation?
Right. Yeah,
I mean,
good point. That's a good
but
point.
they make this argument.
And look, and again, it's an outright lie, and they know that they're lying when they say that we created a state in Gaza, we gave them freedom and independence, and then this is what it looks like. No, and they couldn't claim that actually with a straight face. That, oh, you're saying you did do the two-state solution? Yeah, not exactly. They did this scam. They called it the unilateral withdrawal, the disengagement in 2005. But the reason that they did it was just to prevent there being a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu's guys Ariel Sharon's guys explained, and everyone can look this up. It's Dov Weissglass or Dov Weissglass, D-O-V with no E, Weissglass. And he, the key word for your Google search is formaldehyde. Dov Weissglass, formaldehyde. The whole purpose of the disengagement is to put the peace process in formaldehyde. You know, that's what you use to preserve a corpse, right? We kill the peace process and we essentially freeze everything as it is. And we keep the Palestinians divided and conquered, and so that they can't appeal in any of the international organizations or have anyone intervene on their behalf. And he says, we have received from the U.S. Congress and the president, that is W. Bush, a no one to talk to certificate. And he says, we will have that no one to talk to certificate until Gaza becomes Norway, meaning white and homogeneous and Christian and peaceful and disarmed, and laughed about it and said, see you then, and shalom. Okay. And then this is the same process. I'm sure you know some of this history, and your people should know. Always look up Andrew Higgins in the Wall Street Journal, and then especially Richard Sale in UPI has a really great piece about how Israel had, since the 1980s, had groomed Hamas and built up Hamas deliberately for the explicit purpose of dividing and conquering the Palestinians. The PLO had been sort of secular and commie and somewhat nationalist as well. And so they built up, just as they did in Egypt and everywhere else, where the nationalists and the communists were the enemies, they built up the Islamists. You know, the Americans and the Brits did in those countries. And in this case, the Israelis played the same game with Hamas, and they built up Sheikh Yassin. Now, the thing was created by the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not saying the Israelis created Hamas, but they deliberately facilitated its rise, and including directly financing them and arresting all of their opponents and leaving them free to build up their right-wing religious alternative to the PLO. And the whole purpose, again, was to divide and conquer the Palestinians. And this goes back to the 1980s. This was always the policy with Hamas. Then what happened was the election of 2006, where, first of all, W. Bush forced them to hold the election. He said, you know, they want to negotiate for a Palestinian state, but why should the Israelis have to negotiate with someone who wasn't democratically elected? Yeah, right. He just came home from his meeting with the Saudi king, His Royal Highness Majesty, and all this. But no, the people of Palestine they shouldn't have to suffer under Yasser Arafat's tyranny. He has no right to speak for them. They have to hold this election. So and I guess he had just died. So it was Abbas and his guys. But the PA, you have to understand, is not a government either. It was created by the United States and Israel to be the trustees to rule over the Palestinians in the process, is sort of a halfway house in the process of moving toward the Palestinian state that they never moved toward. So here the PA has nothing to show for all their obsequious, sucking up to and bowing down before the Americans and the Israelis. I mean, their security forces trained by General Dayton. George W. Bush set the U.S. Army to train the Palestinian security forces. That's who they're answerable to, or where they come from anyway. So they had no popular support whatsoever, just as they don't now. And they've been completely unable to deliver on any of their promises. And so Hamas won a plurality in that election in January of 06, Kim. And in fact, they didn't even win a majority in a single district anywhere in Palestine. They just won a plurality. That was another problem with the PA, is a bunch of different leaders after Arafat was, I don't know for certain if he was assassinated or not. There was a Norwegian investigation that said that he was murdered with polonium, which probably was the Israelis. Although that's sort of in dispute, and I don't really know if he was sick and died or murdered. But anyway, after he had died, the PA had split, and a bunch of guys had split the vote against each other, and where Hamas stayed unified. And so Hamas won a majority in the parliament. But again, this is not a parliament of a real government. This is this pseudo-Palestinian Authority parliament, halfway house thing created by the Americans and the Israelis. And they still had to form a coalition government with Fatah, that is the secular commie PLO. So then the Israelis they punished Fatah. They punished the PLO and the Palestinian Authority for Hamas winning. They cut off all of the tax revenue, which Israel collects at the border posts and everything, and refused to distribute it to the PA and weaken their position compared to Hamas. And everyone should read this article. It's a really great article. It's by David Rose in Vanity Fair. It's called The Gaza Bombshell. And it's about how America and Israel and Egypt all teamed up to do a coup d'etat against Hamas in 07, which failed. And it led to Hamas running Fatah right out of the West Bank, right out of the Gaza Strip. So at that time, they had like this coalition government. And the idea was, can we try to marginalize the worst kooks in Hamas and bring the more moderate ones and have them deal? After all, Al-Qaeda's denouncing them for participating in democracy at all. They won an election. They're participating in the parliament. Can we somehow, try to encourage the more moderate forces to form a responsible thing here? Well, they don't want that. That smacks of the possibility of peace. And so they tried to do this coup, which failed. And it's amazing, actually, Kim, in the article, Rose quotes David Wormser, who was Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor and who had come up with this harebrained clean break policy for getting rid of Saddam Hussein to empower Israel back in 1996 for Netanyahu. And yet he was all upset about this coup and squealed on Elliot Abrams and some of the other neocons who were responsible for the policy in the article. So there's some amazing quotes of David Wormser there explaining how all of this took place. And so this is how Hamas then took over the Gaza Strip. And then ever since then, the Netanyahu doctrine, as I said, was half, we're going to make this deal with the Arab states so that without you, Palestinians. Well, the other half of it was to prevent the political pressure from the US, the EU, and any liberal forces in Israel toward a Palestinian state. They would prop up Hamas in Gaza. And my most recent article at antiwar.com, it's written with Connor Freeman. It's called Netanyahu's Support for Hamas Backfired. And it's about how that same policy that Richard Sale documented in UPI about supporting Hamas to divide and conquer the Palestinians back, in the I guess he wrote that article in like 2002 about the early history of this, that was the same policy that Netanyahu picked back up again And quite explicitly and deliberately so, they said this over and over and over again. I got all the quotes, and now the New York Times has finally begun to cover it. They had two recent pieces this month of December 2023 about it. Buying quiet. That's what the New York Times called it, buying quiet. And what they all say over and over and over, explicitly over and over and over, leaders of Shin Bet, leaders of Hamas, leaders of the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, Bezalel Smotrich, his finance minister from the Jewish Zionist party, or the Jewish Zionist party, and all kinds of Netanyahu flunkies. They all say it over and over and over again. Why do we want to support Hamas in Gaza? To prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. Come on, Kim. We have no partner for peace. You don't expect us to negotiate with these terrorists, do you? And so that was why they were propping up the terrorists. It was just so that they could point at them. A perfect little enemy for Likud. And Netanyahu said, as he instructed his party leadership about why they were doing this, he says, listen, don't worry. We control the height of the flames. In other words, yes, these guys are dangerous terrorists, and they are truly a clique to the left of al-Qaeda. I mean, they are really bad guys, Hamas. Not that they're internationalists, but they are Islamists, and they are ruthless killers of civilians and terrorists, and they have been for a very long time. Yeah. So Netanyahu's saying, yeah, they're dangerous, but don't worry. I'm King Bibi. I know what I'm doing. But he doesn't know what he's doing. Right? Just like he got up to the UN and gave that braggadocious speech and said, I got away with it. 2 weeks later, the flames jumped out, burnt the whole house down.